66 million years ago, on a day that geologists now place with remarkable precision within the broader span of deep time, an object roughly 10 kilometers across, traveling through space at a velocity exceeding 60,000 kilometers per hour, struck the shallow coastal waters of what is now the northern Yucatán Peninsula in Mexico. The scale of this event, even when described in the careful and necessarily restrained language of modern geological science, strains ordinary human comprehension. The asteroid, or possibly comet, that struck the Earth on that day released energy equivalent, by various scientific estimates, to several billion times the energy released by the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, an amount of energy delivered not gradually but within a span of seconds, as the object's enormous kinetic energy was converted, almost instantaneously, into heat, shock waves, and the violent ejection of vaporized rock high into and beyond the Earth's atmosphere. The immediate consequences, reconstructed by geologists and paleontologists working across multiple decades of careful and increasingly sophisticated scientific investigation, included earthquakes of a magnitude far exceeding anything in the subsequent record of human seismological observation, tsunamis that swept across ocean basins, and a global firestorm ignited by the superheated debris that rained back down through the atmosphere across the planet's entire surface in the hours following. The impact. In the months that followed, the dust and sulfate aerosols injected into the atmosphere by the impact blocked enough sunlight to collapse photosynthesis across much of the planet, triggering a cascading collapse of food chains that, within a geologically brief period, eliminated approximately 3/4 of all species then living on Earth. Among the casualties of this extinction event were the non-avian dinosaurs, a group of animals that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for more than 150 million years, and whose sudden and complete disappearance from the fossil record at precisely this geological boundary represents one of the most striking and most thoroughly documented patterns in the entire history of paleontology. The extinction cleared ecological space that would, over the following tens of millions of years, be filled by the diversification of mammals, a lineage that had existed in the shadow of dinosaurs for the entirety of their long reign and that would, following their disappearance, eventually produce the line of descent leading to human beings. Tonight we reconstruct that day, and the years and decades of careful scientific detective work that allowed researchers to identify exactly what happened, exactly where it happened, and exactly how its consequences unfolded across the following minutes, hours, months, and years. In a story that connects a buried crater off the coast of Mexico to the layer of unusual clay found in rock formations around the entire world, and ultimately to the basic shape of life on the planet we inhabit today. The specific scientific journey that led researchers to identify the cause of what paleontologists call the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, often abbreviated as the KPG boundary event, began not with the discovery of the crater itself, but with a puzzling geochemical anomaly identified in rock layers from a location far from the impact site. In 1980, the physicist Luis Alvarez, working together with his son, the geologist Walter Alvarez, and several colleagues, published a now famous scientific paper proposing that the abrupt disappearance of dinosaurs and numerous other species at the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene geological periods had been caused by the impact of a large asteroid or comet. Their evidence centered on the discovery of unusually high concentrations of the element iridium in a thin clay layer found precisely at this geological boundary in rock formations in Italy, and subsequently confirmed at numerous other locations around the world. Iridium is an element that occurs only very rarely in the Earth's crust, but that is considerably more common in asteroids and other extraterrestrial bodies, making its unusual concentration at this specific geological boundary a striking and, to the Alvarez team, highly suggestive piece of evidence pointing toward an impact event of considerable scale, one large enough to have distributed iridium-enriched material across the entire planet in a thin, globally consistent layer. The specific scientific reception of this hypothesis, when it was first proposed, was notably mixed, with considerable skepticism from many paleontologists who had developed alternative explanations for the extinction event, including theories centered on more gradual climatic or volcanic causes, and who were not initially persuaded that a single, sudden impact event could adequately explain the complex pattern of extinction and survival documented in the fossil record. The specific scientific debate that followed the Alvarez team's 1980 publication continued for more than a decade, as researchers on different sides of the question marshaled additional evidence and developed increasingly sophisticated models to test the competing hypotheses. This debate, while sometimes characterized in popular accounts as a simple contest between an emerging impact hypothesis and an outdated resistance to it, in fact involved genuinely difficult and important scientific questions regarding how to interpret the available paleontological and geological evidence, questions that required considerably more evidence than the iridium anomaly alone to resolve with scientific confidence. The specific piece of evidence that would eventually prove decisive in resolving this debate, the actual physical crater produced by the impact, had in fact already been identified by petroleum geologists working in Mexico decades earlier, though its true significance would not become apparent until researchers studying the extinction event connected these separate lines of investigation together in the early 1990s. The Chicxulub crater itself, named after a small town near its center on the Yucatán Peninsula, had been identified by petroleum exploration geologists working for the Mexican state oil company Pemex as early as the late 1970s, though its specific significance as an impact crater and its connection to the KPG extinction event would not be recognized until considerably later. The crater's existence was initially detected through gravitational and magnetic anomaly surveys, geophysical techniques commonly used in petroleum exploration to identify underground geological structures that might indicate the presence of oil-bearing rock formations. These surveys revealed a roughly circular pattern of gravitational and magnetic anomalies centered near the town of Chicxulub, a pattern that the Pemex geologists who first identified it considered geologically unusual, though its specific origin as an impact crater was not the immediate or obvious interpretation that occurred to researchers working primarily within the petroleum exploration context in which the structure was first identified. The crater is almost entirely buried beneath both the limestone bedrock of the Yucatán Peninsula, which has accumulated above the impact structure over the 66 million years since the impact occurred, and, for its offshore portion, beneath the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, making it entirely invisible at the Earth's surface and explaining why a structure of such enormous scale, with an estimated diameter of approximately 180 kilometers, could remain unrecognized for as long as it did, even as researchers studying the KPG extinction event were actively searching for physical evidence of exactly the kind of impact structure that had, without anyone yet realizing it, already been identified through unrelated petroleum exploration research. The specific connection between the buried Yucatán structure and the KPG extinction event was eventually established in the early 1990s, as researchers including Alan Hildebrand, working with rock core samples originally collected by Pemex geologists and subsequently made available for broader scientific research, identified geological features within these samples, including shocked quartz crystals and other mineralogical evidence characteristic of extreme impact pressures, that confirmed the structure's origin as an impact crater and established its age as corresponding precisely to the KPG boundary, the exact geological moment at which the mass extinction event had occurred. This identification, bringing together the geochemical evidence that the Alvarez team had identified a decade earlier with the physical crater structure that Pemex geologists had unknowingly already discovered years before that, represented a watershed moment in the scientific investigation of the KPG extinction event, providing researchers with the specific physical location and scale of the impact event that the iridium evidence had suggested but could not, on its own, definitively confirm or precisely locate. The specific physical characteristics of the Chicxulub impact, reconstructed through decades of subsequent geological and geophysical research, allow scientists to describe the event with a degree of detail that goes considerably beyond simply confirming that an impact occurred. The impacting object is generally estimated to have measured approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, based on the scale of the resulting crater and on physical models relating impactor size to crater dimensions, though the precise composition of the object, whether it was a rocky asteroid or an icy comet, remains a subject of some ongoing scientific discussion, with the balance of current geochemical evidence from the crater itself generally favoring an asteroid origin, specifically suggesting a connection to a particular class of carbonaceous asteroids whose chemical composition matches certain isotopic signatures identified in the boundary clay layer found at sites around the world. The specific velocity at which the object struck the Earth, estimated at somewhere between 20 and 70 kilometers per second, depending on the specific orbital trajectory and impact angle involved, would have meant that the entire process from the object's first contact with the upper atmosphere to its complete impact with the Earth's surface occurred within a span of just a few seconds, far too brief an interval for the object's enormous kinetic energy to be meaningfully dissipated through atmospheric friction in the way that smaller meteoroids typically experience during atmospheric entry. The specific location of the impact, in a shallow sea environment containing a substantial layer of sulfur-rich evaporite rock beneath the relatively thin layer of ocean water and surface limestone, has been identified by researchers as a particularly significant factor contributing to the event's catastrophic global consequences, since the impact's enormous energy vaporized and ejected vast quantities of this sulfur-rich material into the atmosphere alongside the more typically expected pulverized rock and dust, producing sulfate aerosols capable of blocking sunlight considerably more effectively and for a considerably longer duration than a comparable impact occurring in a different geological setting might have produced. The specific angle and direction of the impact, reconstructed through detailed analysis of the crater's asymmetric structure and through computer modeling of the impact dynamics, has been estimated by some researchers as occurring at a relatively steep angle, a finding with significant implications for understanding the specific distribution and severity of the impact's immediate destructive effects, since impact angle significantly affects how efficiently an impactor's kinetic energy is converted into the various forms of destructive energy, including the ejecta plume, seismic shock, and thermal radiation, that the impact subsequently produced across the surrounding region and, ultimately, across the entire planet. The immediate physical consequences of the impact, occurring within the first minutes and hours following the asteroid's collision with the Earth, represent some of the most violent and most rapidly unfolding events in the entire geological history of the planet, and reconstructing their precise sequence and magnitude has required researchers to combine physical evidence from the impact site itself with sophisticated computer modeling of impact physics. The impact itself would have instantaneously vaporized the asteroid along with a substantial volume of the target rock at the impact site, creating a fireball of plasma and superheated gas that would have, within fractions of a second, expanded outward and upward, ejecting material at velocities sufficient to carry significant portions of it entirely beyond the Earth's atmosphere and into a ballistic trajectory that would eventually distribute debris across the entire planet's surface, including the specific layer of iridium-enriched clay that the Alvarez team had originally identified at sites as geographically distant from the Yucatán Peninsula as Italy and New Zealand. The seismic energy released by the impact would have generated earthquakes of an estimated magnitude considerably exceeding 10 on the modern seismological scale, an intensity so far beyond the range of historically observed earthquakes that geologists studying the event have had to rely primarily on theoretical physical modeling, rather than any directly comparable historical observation, to estimate the specific severity and geographic extent of the resulting seismic disturbance, which would have radiated outward from the impact site and would have been detectable, in some form, across the entire planet within minutes of the initial impact. The displacement of ocean water at the impact site, combined with the underwater landslides that the impact's seismic shock would have triggered across the surrounding continental shelf, generated tsunamis that geological evidence, including distinctive disturbed sediment layers found at coastal sites across the Gulf of Mexico region and beyond, indicates reached heights of potentially more than 100 meters in the immediate vicinity of the impact, with smaller but still highly destructive waves propagating across ocean basins worldwide within the hours following the impact. Perhaps most significantly for the broader extinction event that followed, the impact's ejecta, the vast quantity of pulverized and superheated rock thrown high into and above the atmosphere by the impact, would have begun, within minutes to hours, raining back down across the entire planet's surface, with the friction of this re-entering debris heating the upper atmosphere to temperature sufficient, according to several detailed climate modeling studies, to have ignited widespread wildfires across forested regions worldwide, producing a global firestorm whose specific severity and geographic extent remains a subject of continuing scientific refinement, but whose broad outline, a planet-wide conflagration following within hours of the initial impact, represents one of the more genuinely terrifying reconstructions that paleoclimate science has produced regarding this catastrophic event. The longer-term atmospheric and climatic consequences of the impact, unfolding over the weeks, months, and years following the initial event, represent the mechanism by which the impact's destructive effects, however severe in their immediate vicinity, were translated into the global mass extinction that eliminated such a substantial proportion of the planet's species. The combination of fine dust particles and sulfate aerosols injected into the upper atmosphere by the impact, and further supplemented by soot from the global wildfires that the initial impact triggered, would have produced a sustained reduction in the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface, with various climate modeling studies estimating that photosynthesis may have been substantially reduced or even entirely halted across much of the planet for a period that some models suggest may have extended for several years following the impact, an interruption with catastrophic consequences for the plant life and phytoplankton that form the base of nearly all terrestrial and marine food chains. This disruption of photosynthesis, sometimes referred to by researchers studying the event as an impact winter, in deliberate comparison to the better-known concept of nuclear winter that emerged from Cold War-era research into the potential climatic consequences of large-scale nuclear conflict, would have produced a cascading collapse of food chains beginning with the most immediately affected photosynthetic organisms and propagating upward through herbivorous species that depended on plant matter for sustenance, and subsequently to the carnivorous species that depended, in turn, on those herbivores. The specific pattern of survival and extinction documented in the fossil record at the KPG boundary provides considerable support for this general mechanism, since the species that appear to have survived the extinction event in greatest proportion tend to share certain ecological characteristics consistent with greater resilience to exactly this kind of severe and prolonged disruption of the food chain's photosynthetic base, including smaller body size, the ability to subsist on detritus or on a broader range of food sources rather than depending on any single specific prey type, and, in some cases, the capacity to enter prolonged dormant states, including hibernation or analogous physiological adaptations, that would have allowed certain species to survive extended periods of severely reduced food availability. The specific duration and severity of this period of disrupted photosynthesis and collapsed food chains remains a subject of ongoing scientific refinement, as researchers continue to develop increasingly sophisticated climate models incorporating updated estimates of the specific quantities of dust, soot, and sulfate aerosols that the impact and its associated wildfires would have injected into the atmosphere, work that continues to refine, without fundamentally altering, the broad scientific consensus that this period of severely disrupted global photosynthesis represents the primary mechanism by which the initial, geographically localized impact event was translated into a genuinely global mass extinction affecting species across every continent and every ocean. The specific pattern of which species survived and which species went extinct at the KPG boundary represents one of the most thoroughly documented and most scientifically informative aspects of this entire extinction event, providing researchers with detailed evidence regarding exactly what kinds of ecological and physiological characteristics proved advantageous or disadvantageous during this catastrophic period of environmental disruption. The non-avian dinosaurs, despite their tremendous prior diversity and their dominance of terrestrial ecosystems for more than 150 million years prior to the extinction event, were eliminated entirely and with apparently no exceptions, a pattern that paleontologists have connected to several characteristics common across this diverse group, including, in many though not all cases, relatively large body size requiring substantial food intake and ecological dependence on food. Chains that would have been severely disrupted by the collapse of photosynthesis-based primary production that the impact's climatic consequences produced. Birds, in striking contrast to their close evolutionary relatives among the non-avian dinosaurs, survived the extinction event, with the lineage leading to all modern bird species tracing its ancestry through this catastrophic boundary, a survival that paleontologists have connected to several specific characteristics that distinguished birds from their non-avian dinosaur relatives at the time of the extinction, including generally smaller body size, greater dietary flexibility including the ability to subsist on seeds and other food sources that may have remained more available during the period of disrupted photosynthesis, and, in some lineages, the capacity for flight that may have facilitated movement to more favorable environmental conditions during the period of acute crisis. Mammals, similarly, survived the extinction event in considerably greater proportion than many other major animal groups, a pattern that paleontologists connect to characteristics including, again, generally small body size among the mammal species existing at this time, burrowing or other behaviors that may have provided some degree of protection from the immediate thermal effects of the global wildfires, and dietary flexibility that allowed many surviving mammal lineages to subsist on a broader range of food sources, including detritus, insects, and seeds, during the period of severely disrupted primary plant productivity that followed the impact. The specific marine ecosystem consequences of the extinction event, while somewhat less central to popular understanding of the KPG extinction compared to the well-known disappearance of dinosaurs, were in fact equally dramatic and equally well documented in the fossil record, with the collapse of photosynthetic marine phytoplankton populations producing cascading extinctions throughout marine food chains, eliminating, among numerous other marine groups, the ammonites, a group of shelled marine mollusks that had been ecologically prominent and remarkably diverse throughout the preceding hundreds of millions of years of Earth's history, and whose complete disappearance at the KPG boundary represents one of the most striking and most thoroughly documented marine extinction patterns associated with this broader global catastrophe. The specific fossil evidence documenting the precise timing and immediate aftermath of the extinction event, recovered from a limited number of exceptionally well-preserved geological sites, has provided researchers with remarkably detailed insight into the specific sequence of events occurring in the hours, days, and years immediately following the impact. The Tanis fossil site in North Dakota, the subject of considerable scientific and public attention following the publication of detailed research findings beginning in 2019, has yielded an extraordinary collection of fossils that researchers argue preserve evidence from literally the same day as the impact itself, including fish fossils containing embedded glass spherules, tiny droplets of molten rock ejected by the impact and rapidly cooled into glass during their high-altitude ballistic trajectory before falling back to Earth and becoming lodged in the gills of fish that, according to the researchers' interpretation of the site, died within hours of the impact as a seismic surge disturbed the river system in which they were living, depositing them rapidly within sediment that subsequently preserved this remarkably precise snapshot of the extinction event's earliest and most immediate consequences. The specific scientific claims associated with the Tanis site, while generating considerable popular and media attention given their remarkable specificity in connecting individual fossil specimens to the precise day of the impact itself, have also generated some degree of scientific debate regarding the specific interpretation of the site's formation and the precise confidence with which such an exact temporal connection to the impact day can be established, illustrating the genuinely careful and sometimes contentious process by which extraordinary scientific claims, however compelling their initial presentation, require sustained peer review and independent verification before achieving the status of broadly accepted scientific consensus. Other fossil sites documenting the years and centuries immediately following the extinction event, including various locations in North America's Hell Creek Formation and at numerous other KPG boundary sites around the world, have provided researchers with detailed evidence regarding the specific pattern of ecological recovery that followed the initial catastrophe, documenting how surviving species gradually recolonized and rediversified within the ecological niches left vacant by the extinction of dinosaurs and numerous other major animal groups, a process that, while occurring over a geologically brief time frame compared to the preceding 100 million years of dinosaur dominance, nonetheless unfolded across many thousands of years rather than within the lifetime of any individual organism that experienced the initial catastrophic event itself. The specific scientific value of these various exceptionally preserved fossil sites lies in the way they allow researchers to move beyond the broader statistical patterns of extinction and survival documented across the global fossil record, and to examine, with considerably greater specificity and immediacy, exactly how individual organisms and individual ecosystems actually experienced and responded to this catastrophic period in the planet's history, providing a level of temporal and ecological detail that complements and enriches the broader geochemical and geophysical evidence regarding the impact event's overall global consequences. The specific question of how long the dinosaurs had already been in decline, if at all, prior to the Chicxulub impact, has been a subject of considerable and at times contentious scientific debate, connected to broader questions regarding whether the KPG extinction event should be understood as a sudden catastrophe striking a thriving and ecologically dominant group of animals, or as a final blow delivered to a group already experiencing some degree of ecological stress or declining diversity. In the millions of years immediately preceding the impact, some paleontological research, examining the diversity and abundance of dinosaur fossils in the geological strata immediately preceding the KPG boundary, has suggested evidence for declining dinosaur diversity in at least some specific regions and specific dinosaur groups during the final few million years of the Cretaceous period, raising the possibility that environmental changes occurring independently of and prior to the Chicxulub impact, potentially including the climatic effects of substantial volcanic activity associated with the Deccan Traps volcanic province in what is now India, may have already been placing ecological stress on at least some dinosaur populations before the impact delivered its catastrophic final blow. Other paleontological research, however, employing different statistical and sampling methodologies for assessing fossil diversity patterns in the rock record, has reached more skeptical conclusions regarding the strength and reliability of the evidence for pre-impact dinosaur decline, suggesting that at least some of the apparent diversity decline documented in certain studies may reflect limitations and biases in the available fossil record itself, including the simple reality that fossil preservation becomes increasingly patchy and incomplete as researchers examine increasingly narrow and specific time windows immediately preceding the KPG boundary, rather than necessarily reflecting a genuine biological decline in dinosaur populations during this period. The specific role of the Deccan Traps volcanic activity, a series of massive volcanic eruptions that produced enormous volumes of lava across a substantial portion of what is now India over a period spanning, according to current dating evidence, several 100,000 years overlapping with the KPG boundary, has itself become a subject of considerable independent scientific research and debate, with some researchers proposing that the climatic effects of this volcanic activity, including the release of substantial quantities of climate-altering volcanic gases, may have independently contributed to environmental stress on global ecosystems during this period, potentially compounding or even rivaling the climatic effects of the Chicxulub impact itself in their broader ecological significance. This ongoing scientific discussion regarding the relative contribution of pre-existing ecological stress, Deccan Traps volcanism, and the Chicxulub impact itself to the overall pattern of KPG extinction illustrates the genuine scientific complexity involved in fully understanding even an extinction event for which the basic triggering mechanism, the asteroid impact, has been established with very high scientific confidence, since establishing the immediate cause of a catastrophic event does not, on its own, fully resolve more nuanced questions regarding the broader ecological context within which that catastrophic event occurred and the specific relative contribution of multiple potentially interacting environmental stresses to the ultimate pattern of extinction that the fossil record documents. The specific evolutionary consequences of the KPG extinction event, unfolding over the tens of millions of years following the initial catastrophe, represent one of the more significant and most thoroughly studied examples in the entire fossil record of how mass extinction events can fundamentally reshape the subsequent trajectory of evolutionary history. The elimination of non-avian dinosaurs from terrestrial ecosystems removed a group of animals that had, for more than 150 million years, occupied the dominant ecological positions across the full range of terrestrial habitats, from small insectivorous niches to massive herbivorous and carnivorous roles at the top of terrestrial food chains. The sudden absence of dinosaurs from these ecological positions created what evolutionary biologists describe as vacant ecological niches, opportunities for other lineages of animals to evolve and diversify into ecological roles that dinosaurs had, prior to the extinction event, effectively monopolized. Mammals, which had existed throughout the entire span of dinosaur dominance as a generally small-bodied and ecologically constrained group of animals, occupying primarily nocturnal, insectivorous, or otherwise relatively modest ecological niches throughout the preceding 100 million years or more, underwent a remarkably rapid and remarkably extensive evolutionary diversification in the millions of years immediately following the KPG extinction event, with the fossil record documenting the emergence of numerous new mammalian lineages occupying ecological roles, including larger body sizes and a considerably broader range of dietary specializations that had simply not been available to mammals while dinosaurs continued to occupy and dominate these ecological positions. This post-extinction mammalian diversification, documented in considerable detail through the fossil record of the early Paleogene period immediately following the KPG boundary, eventually produced the full range of mammalian diversity that characterizes the modern world, including the specific evolutionary lineages that would, over the subsequent tens of millions of years, eventually lead to the emergence of primates, and considerably later, to the emergence of the human species itself, establishing a direct, if obviously highly contingent and far from inevitable, evolutionary connection between the Chicxulub impact and the eventual existence of human beings as a species. The specific scientific and philosophical significance of this evolutionary connection, while sometimes expressed in popular accounts through somewhat simplified claims that human beings exist specifically because of this single asteroid impact, deserves some careful qualification, since the specific evolutionary pathway connecting the post-extinction mammalian radiation to the eventual emergence of any particular species, including humans, involved an enormously complex and genuinely contingent sequence of subsequent evolutionary events spanning tens of millions of years, during which numerous other historical contingencies, entirely independent of the original Chicxulub impact, played equally essential roles in shaping the specific evolutionary trajectory that eventually led to the emergence of our own species. The specific scientific debate regarding the precise relationship between the Chicxulub impact and the Deccan Traps volcanism, both of which occurred within a relatively narrow window of geological time surrounding the KPG boundary, has generated some of the more methodologically sophisticated and most actively contested research within the broader field of KPG extinction studies. Researchers studying the precise dating of both events, using increasingly refined radiometric dating techniques applied to volcanic rock samples from the Deccan Traps and to impact-related material from the Chicxulub crater and its associated global ejecta deposits, have worked to establish with as much precision as currently available scientific methods allow the specific temporal relationship between these two major geological events, seeking to determine whether the most intense phase of Deccan Trap's volcanic activity occurred before, simultaneously with, or after the Chicxulub impact itself. Some researchers have specifically proposed that the Chicxulub impact's enormous seismic energy may have triggered or substantially intensified ongoing volcanic activity at the Deccan Traps, despite the very considerable geographic distance separating the impact site in present-day Mexico from the volcanic province in present-day India. A hypothesis grounded in physical models suggesting that an impact of sufficient magnitude could theoretically transmit seismic energy capable of affecting magma chamber dynamics at volcanically active locations located even at very substantial distances from the impact site itself. Other researchers, while acknowledging the intriguing temporal coincidence between these two major geological events, have expressed greater scientific caution regarding the specific causal mechanism proposed to connect them, noting both the considerable remaining uncertainty in the precise dating of the most intense phases of Deccan Traps activity relative to the Chicxulub impact, and the more general scientific challenge of establishing confident causal relationships between geological events separated by such enormous distances, even when proposed physical mechanisms for such a connection can be theoretically modeled. This ongoing and genuinely active scientific debate regarding the precise relationship between impact and volcanism illustrates a broader and important characteristic of contemporary KPG extinction research. Even as the basic outline of the extinction event, an asteroid impact at Chicxulub triggering catastrophic and rapid global environmental disruption, has achieved very high scientific confidence and broad consensus acceptance, numerous more specific questions regarding the precise relative contribution of various contributing factors, the precise timing and sequence of events, and the precise mechanisms by which the initial impact's effects propagated and interacted with other concurrent geological processes, remain subjects of genuinely active scientific investigation and legitimate ongoing scholarly disagreement. The specific methods that researchers have developed for dating the Chicxulub impact with the remarkable precision that contemporary scientific publications now routinely cite represent a significant achievement of modern geochronology, the scientific discipline concerned with precisely dating geological events and materials. Radiometric dating techniques, which measure the predictable rate of radioactive decay in certain isotopes contained within rock samples to calculate the time elapsed since those rocks formed or were last significantly altered, have been applied to material recovered from the Chicxulub crater itself, as well as to glass spherules and other impact-related material found in KPG boundary deposits at numerous sites around the world, allowing researchers to establish the impact's age with a precision, in the most recent and most methodologically refined studies, of within approximately 30,000 years, an extraordinarily precise measurement when considered against the impact's overall age of 66 million years. The specific consistency between dating results obtained from the Chicxulub crater itself and dating results obtained from KPG boundary material found at geographically distant sites around the world has provided researchers with strong independent confirmation that the impact event documented at Chicxulub and the global extinction event documented in the KPG boundary clay layer found worldwide indeed represent the same singular geological event, rather than two separate events that happened to occur in relatively close temporal proximity to each other, a finding that has been essential to establishing the high degree of scientific confidence that now characterizes the broader scientific consensus regarding the Chicxulub impact's role as the primary trigger of the KPG mass extinction. Beyond simply establishing the impact's precise age, researchers have also applied various geochemical and isotopic analysis techniques to material recovered from the Chicxulub crater and from boundary clay deposits worldwide in an effort to more precisely characterize the specific composition of the impacting object itself, work that has contributed to the current scientific understanding favoring an asteroid, rather than comet, origin for the impactor, and that has further allowed researchers To draw connections between the Chicxulub impactor's specific chemical signature and certain categories of asteroids whose general compositional characteristics have been independently studied through both meteorite samples recovered on Earth and through direct spacecraft observation of asteroids in our solar system. This combination of precise dating and detailed geochemical characterization represents the kind of rigorous, multiply-corroborated scientific evidence that has allowed the Chicxulub impact hypothesis to move, over the more than 4 decades since the Alvarez team's initial 1980 publication, from an initially controversial and actively debated scientific proposal to what is now widely regarded as one of the most thoroughly confirmed and most scientifically well-established explanations for any major event in the entire geological history of our planet. The specific broader scientific significance of the KPG extinction event, considered within the context of the broader history of mass extinctions documented throughout the fossil record, connects this particular catastrophic event to a series of broader scientific questions regarding the general patterns and mechanisms underlying major biological crises throughout Earth's history. The KPG extinction represents one of 5 generally recognized major mass extinction events documented in the fossil record over the past several hundred million years, a group of catastrophic biological crises that paleontologists collectively refer to as the Big Five mass extinctions, each characterized by the elimination of a substantial proportion of the species existing on Earth at the time, though each event also differs considerably from the others in its specific underlying causes. Its specific geographic and ecological patterns of extinction and survival, and the specific evidence available for reconstructing exactly what happened and why. The KPG extinction holds a particular and somewhat unusual position within this broader comparative framework, since it remains, among these 5 major extinction events, the only one for which scientists have achieved very high confidence in identifying a single, specific, and precisely datable triggering event, the Chicxulub impact, as opposed to the considerably more gradual, more geographically diffuse, and generally less precisely datable combinations of volcanic activity, climate change, and other environmental factors that are generally understood to have driven the other 4 major extinction events recognized within this broader comparative framework, including the considerably larger Permian-Triassic extinction event of approximately 252 million years ago, which eliminated an even greater proportion of contemporary species, but whose specific causal mechanisms remain considerably less precisely understood and more actively debated than those underlying the KPG event. This relatively unusual scientific clarity regarding the KPG extinction's specific triggering mechanism has made it a particularly valuable case study for researchers seeking to understand the general principles by which sudden, catastrophic environmental disruptions translate into mass extinction patterns, since the relatively well-constrained nature of the Chicxulub impact event, in terms of both its precise timing and its general physical characteristics, allows researchers to develop and test detailed quantitative models of extinction dynamics with a degree of confidence regarding the initial triggering conditions that is simply not available for the other major mass extinction events documented in the fossil record. The specific comparative insights that researchers have drawn from studying the KPG extinction alongside these other major mass extinction events have contributed significantly to broader scientific understanding regarding which ecological and physiological characteristics tend to confer greater resilience during periods of severe and rapid environmental disruption, insights that, beyond their purely historical and paleontological significance, have also informed contemporary scientific discussions regarding the ecological consequences of the ongoing human-caused biodiversity crisis that many contemporary biologists have characterized, with varying degrees of caution regarding the specific terminology, as representing the early stages of a 6th major mass extinction event currently unfolding across the modern biosphere. The specific question of what, precisely, would have happened if the Chicxulub impact had occurred at a slightly different location, or had struck the Earth at a slightly different angle or velocity, has become a subject of genuine and methodologically rigorous scientific investigation, rather than merely idle speculation, as researchers have sought to better understand exactly which specific characteristics of this particular impact event contributed most significantly to its catastrophic global consequences. Several research teams have specifically examined the question of how the impact's consequences might have differed had the asteroid struck a different type of geological target, noting that the specific presence of substantial sulfur-rich evaporite rock formations beneath the relatively shallow seas of the Yucatán Peninsula appears to have been a particularly significant factor contributing to the severity of the resulting atmospheric sulfate aerosol production, and that an impact of comparable size and velocity striking a different geological target, lacking this specific sulfur-rich composition, might plausibly have produced a less severe and less prolonged period of atmospheric darkening and associated photosynthesis collapse, potentially resulting in a less catastrophic overall extinction event. This line of research has led some scientists to characterize the Chicxulub impact's specific location as representing a particularly unfortunate geological circumstance, sometimes described in popular scientific accounts using language suggesting that the asteroid struck one of the worst possible locations on the entire planet's surface in terms of its potential to trigger maximally severe global environmental consequences, though researchers engaged in this line of investigation are generally careful to note the inherent scientific difficulty of definitively establishing precisely how much less severe the extinction event might have been under alternative geological circumstances, given the considerable remaining uncertainty in modeling the precise atmospheric and ecological consequences of impacts under hypothetical alternative conditions that did not, of course, actually occur. The specific question of impact angle has similarly attracted considerable scientific modeling attention, with some research suggesting that the specific steep angle at which the Chicxulub impactor is estimated to have struck the Earth's surface may have contributed to a particularly efficient conversion of the impactor's kinetic energy into the kind of widespread ejecta distribution and associated global atmospheric effects that drove the extinction event's catastrophic global reach, as opposed to a more glancing impact angle that might, theoretically, have concentrated a greater proportion of the impact's destructive energy within a more geographically limited region. This broader category of scientific research, examining how the specific physical parameters of the Chicxulub impact contributed to its catastrophic global consequences, serves a purpose considerably more significant than simply satisfying scientific curiosity regarding historical contingency, since this research directly informs contemporary scientific and policy efforts to assess the potential consequences of future asteroid impacts, work undertaken by planetary defense researchers and policymakers who must necessarily rely on exactly this kind of detailed physical and ecological modeling to assess the genuine risk that future impact events of varying sizes, locations, and characteristics might pose to contemporary human civilization and to the broader biosphere that supports it. The specific contemporary scientific and policy efforts focused on planetary defense, the systematic effort to identify, track, and potentially mitigate the risk posed by asteroids and comets whose orbits might bring them into collision with Earth, draw directly and explicitly on the scientific understanding of the Chicxulub impact and its catastrophic consequences as a primary motivating case study and source of essential physical data. Organizations including NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office, along with numerous international partner organizations and research institutions, conduct systematic astronomical surveys specifically designed to identify and track near-Earth objects, asteroids and comets whose orbital paths bring them into relatively close proximity to Earth's orbit, with particular scientific and policy attention focused on identifying objects large enough that a potential future impact could produce consequences of a severity comparable to, or even exceeding, the catastrophic global effects that the Chicxulub impact is understood to have produced. The specific scientific understanding of how the Chicxulub impact's catastrophic consequences scaled with the impactor's specific size, velocity, and impact location has directly informed the development of risk assessment models that planetary defense researchers use to evaluate the potential consequences of various hypothetical future impact scenarios. allowing researchers and policymakers to develop more scientifically grounded assessments of which categories of near-Earth objects pose the most significant potential risk to human civilization, and to prioritize astronomical survey and tracking efforts accordingly. The 2022 DART mission, in which NASA successfully altered the orbital trajectory of a small asteroid moon through deliberate spacecraft impact, represented a significant practical demonstration of one potential strategy for actively mitigating the risk posed by a near-Earth object identified as being on a collision course with Earth, providing planetary defense researchers and policymakers with empirically validated evidence regarding the technical feasibility of at least one category of active asteroid deflection technique, work that connects directly, if at a considerable remove of 66 million years, to the broader scientific effort to ensure that humanity does not experience a catastrophic impact event comparable to the one that eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs. This ongoing and genuinely active contemporary scientific and policy effort illustrates how the careful scientific reconstruction of an event from 66 million years in Earth's deep past, achieved through the patient accumulation of geological, geochemical, and paleontological evidence over more than 4 decades of dedicated scientific research, continues to inform genuinely consequential contemporary scientific and policy work focused on protecting human civilization and the broader biosphere from the possibility of experiencing a comparable catastrophic impact event in the future, a future possibility that, while statistically unlikely within any particular human lifetime, remains, according to the same scientific evidence that has so thoroughly documented the Chicxulub impact's catastrophic historical consequences, a genuine and recurring feature of our solar system's long-term dynamics. The specific paleontological evidence documenting the broader pattern of dinosaur diversity and ecology in the final geological stages of the Cretaceous period, immediately preceding the Chicxulub impact, provides essential context for understanding exactly what kind of ecosystems and what kind of animals were eliminated by this catastrophic extinction event. The Hell Creek Formation in Montana and the Dakotas, one of the most thoroughly studied and most fossil-rich geological formations documenting this final pre-extinction period, has yielded an extraordinarily detailed record of the diverse dinosaur communities that inhabited this region of North America immediately before the KPG boundary, including the iconic Tyrannosaurus rex, along with numerous herbivorous dinosaur species including the horned Triceratops and various duck-billed hadrosaur species, providing paleontologists with detailed evidence regarding the specific ecological structure and apparent biological vigor of at least this particular dinosaur-dominated ecosystem in the final period before its complete elimination. The specific scientific debate regarding whether this particular, exceptionally well-documented North American dinosaur fauna can be considered broadly representative of dinosaur ecosystems worldwide during this final pre-extinction period, or whether it might instead represent a somewhat unusual or geographically specific pattern that may not generalize to dinosaur populations in other regions of the planet during this same time period, connects to the broader and more general scientific challenge of fossil record sampling bias, since the geographic and temporal distribution of fossil-rich rock formations available for paleontological study is itself shaped by numerous geological factors entirely unrelated to the actual historical distribution and abundance of the organisms those formations might potentially preserve. Despite these important methodological caveats regarding the representativeness of any single fossil-rich region, the broader pattern documented across the considerable number of KPG boundary sites that have now been studied across multiple continents provides researchers with reasonably strong confidence that the elimination of non-avian dinosaurs at this boundary was a genuinely global phenomenon affecting dinosaur populations across the full range of terrestrial environments and geographic regions in which dinosaurs are documented to have lived during the final stages of the Cretaceous period, rather than representing a more geographically limited extinction pattern that happened to particularly affect the specific, well-studied North American faunas that have historically received disproportionate paleontological research attention. This broader paleontological evidence, documenting the apparent ecological vigor and substantial diversity of at least some dinosaur communities immediately prior to the KPG boundary, has contributed to the now broadly accepted scientific understanding that the Chicxulub impact represented a genuinely sudden and genuinely catastrophic disruption to thriving ecosystems, rather than simply delivering a final blow to dinosaur populations that had already been substantially declining or ecologically struggling for reasons unrelated to the impact event itself, even as more specific and more localized questions regarding pre-impact ecological trends in particular dinosaur lineages or particular geographic regions continue to receive ongoing scientific research attention and continue to generate legitimate scholarly discussion. The specific experience of attempting to reconstruct, in as much physical and temporal detail as the available scientific evidence allows, the actual minute-by-minute and hour-by-hour unfolding of events on the day of the Chicxulub impact itself represents one of the more genuinely remarkable achievements of contemporary paleoclimatology and impact geology, even as researchers engaged in this work remain careful to acknowledge the inherent scientific limitations involved in reconstructing events from such an extraordinarily distant period in Earth's history. Computer modeling studies, incorporating detailed physical simulations of impact dynamics, atmospheric circulation, and subsequent climatic effects, have allowed researchers to develop increasingly detailed and increasingly scientifically grounded reconstructions of the specific sequence of events following the impact, beginning with the instantaneous vaporization of the impactor and target rock at the moment of impact, proceeding through the subsequent minutes during which the resulting fireball and ejecta plume expanded outward and upward, and continuing through the following hours and days during which seismic shock waves, tsunamis, and the global rain of superheated impact debris would have produced their respective catastrophic effects across the planet's surface. The specific reconstruction of the immediate thermal pulse that the impact would have produced, sometimes characterized in popular scientific accounts using the perhaps overly simplified but evocative description of the entire planet's surface briefly experiencing oven-like temperatures as re-entering ejecta heated the upper atmosphere, has been the subject of particularly detailed and particularly careful scientific modeling, since the precise severity, duration, and geographic extent of this thermal pulse carries significant implications for understanding exactly which terrestrial organisms might have survived this most immediate phase of the catastrophe through behaviors including underground burrowing, aquatic habitat use, or other forms of physical shelter from the most extreme and most immediate thermal effects of the impact's aftermath. The Tanis site evidence, discussed previously, along with similarly detailed evidence from other exceptionally preserved fossil sites documenting this immediate post-impact period, provides researchers with at least some direct physical evidence against which these broader theoretical and computational reconstructions can be tested and refined, even as the relatively limited number of such exceptionally preserved sites means that considerable scientific uncertainty necessarily remains regarding the precise universal applicability of patterns documented at any single specific location to the broader, planet-wide unfolding of events on this catastrophic day. This ongoing scientific effort to reconstruct, with ever-increasing physical and temporal precision, the actual specific sequence of events on the day of the Chicxulub impact represents a genuinely remarkable scientific achievement, allowing contemporary researchers and, through their published findings, the broader public, to develop a considerably more detailed and considerably more scientifically grounded understanding of this catastrophic day than would have seemed remotely possible to the scientists who first proposed the impact hypothesis in 1980, working initially from nothing more than an unusual geochemical anomaly identified in a thin layer of ancient clay. The specific broader scientific and cultural significance of the KPG extinction event, and of the dinosaurs whose elimination it produced, extends considerably beyond the purely scientific questions of paleontology and geology that have occupied the bulk of this documentary's attention, touching on broader questions regarding how human culture has understood and represented this distant prehistoric catastrophe. Dinosaurs occupy an unusually prominent position within contemporary popular culture, appearing extensively in children's educational materials, in popular film and television, and in museum exhibitions around the world. A level of popular fascination that paleontologists and science communicators have noted reflects something genuinely distinctive about how human beings relate to these particular extinct animals, perhaps connected to their combination of genuine scientific significance, their often dramatic physical scale, and the inherently evocative narrative of their sudden and complete disappearance from a world that, for more than 150 million years, they had so thoroughly dominated. The specific scientific understanding of the KPG extinction event and its causes has itself evolved considerably within popular cultural representation over the decades since the Alvarez team's initial 1980 proposal, with earlier popular and educational materials often presenting more gradual, climate-based extinction theories that were considered scientifically credible prior to the broader acceptance of the impact hypothesis, illustrating how popular scientific understanding, much like the underlying scientific research itself, develops and changes over time as new evidence accumulates and as scientific consensus shifts in response to that evidence. Contemporary museum exhibitions and educational materials addressing the KPG extinction event have increasingly incorporated the detailed scientific evidence regarding the Chicxulub impact and its specific physical and ecological consequences, reflecting the considerable scientific confidence that this explanation has now achieved, while also, in many cases, working to communicate the genuine remaining scientific uncertainties and ongoing areas of active research discussed throughout this documentary, including questions regarding the precise relative contribution of Deccan Traps volcanism, the precise reconstruction of immediate post-impact events, and the broader comparative significance of this extinction event within the context of Earth's other major mass extinction events. This evolving popular and educational engagement with the KPG extinction event illustrates a broader and genuinely important pattern in how scientific knowledge moves from specialized research literature into broader public understanding, a process that, ideally, involves not simply the transmission of settled scientific conclusions but also some meaningful communication of the genuine scientific process, including the decades of careful evidence gathering, scientific debate, and methodological refinement, through which contemporary scientific understanding of events as distant and as initially mysterious as the extinction of the dinosaurs has gradually been developed and continues to be refined. The specific contemporary relevance of the KPG extinction event for broader scientific and public understanding of biodiversity loss and ecological resilience extends into ongoing scientific discussions regarding the so-called sixth mass extinction, the term that many contemporary biologists have applied to the substantial and ongoing pattern of species extinction and biodiversity decline that human activity has produced over the past several centuries, and particularly over the past several decades. Researchers studying contemporary biodiversity loss have drawn various comparative insights from the KPG extinction and other major mass extinction events documented in the fossil record, examining which ecological and physiological characteristics historically conferred greater resilience during periods of rapid environmental disruption, and considering whether similar patterns might be expected to apply, with appropriate caution regarding the considerable differences between an instantaneous asteroid impact and the more gradual, though still historically rapid, environmental changes that human activity has produced, to the contemporary pattern of biodiversity decline that the modern biosphere is experiencing. The specific scientific debate regarding whether the term sixth mass extinction represents an appropriate and scientifically accurate characterization of contemporary biodiversity loss, as opposed to representing a rhetorically powerful but scientifically imprecise comparison to the considerably more severe and more rapid extinction events documented in the deep geological past, including the KPG event, has itself become a subject of careful scientific discussion, with researchers on different sides of this terminological question generally agreeing on the genuine severity and genuine scientific concern regarding contemporary biodiversity loss, while disagreeing regarding whether direct comparison to events like the KPG extinction helps or potentially distorts public and policy understanding of the specific scale, mechanisms, and time frame of contemporary versus ancient extinction events. Beyond this specific terminological debate, the broader scientific understanding of how the KPG extinction's catastrophic disruption of photosynthesis-based food chains produced cascading ecological collapse has informed contemporary scientific modeling of how various potential future environmental disruptions, including the climatic consequences of large-scale nuclear conflict, sometimes referred to using the deliberately evocative comparative term nuclear winter, might similarly disrupt contemporary global food production and ecological systems, illustrating how the scientific understanding developed through careful study of this ancient catastrophic event continues to inform contemporary scientific modeling of entirely different, though mechanistically related, potential future catastrophic scenarios. This ongoing connection between deep historical paleontological research and contemporary scientific and policy concerns regarding biodiversity loss, nuclear risk, and planetary defense illustrates how the careful scientific reconstruction of even the most temporally distant historical events can continue to generate genuinely significant and genuinely practical contemporary scientific insight, connecting the patient, decades-long scientific detective work that identified and characterized the Chicxulub impact to some of the most pressing scientific and policy concerns facing contemporary human civilization. The specific individuals who contributed to the scientific identification and characterization of the Chicxulub impact, working across more than 4 decades of research spanning multiple scientific disciplines and multiple countries, represent a genuinely collaborative and genuinely international scientific achievement that deserves recognition alongside the more frequently highlighted contributions of Luis and Walter Alvarez. Alan Hildebrand, the researcher whose work in the early 1990s first definitively connected the buried Yucatán geological structure to the KPG extinction event, conducted this crucial identification work building directly on rock core samples that had originally been collected by Pemex geologists working in an entirely different scientific and commercial context decades earlier, illustrating how scientific discovery often depends on the often unplanned and unanticipated convergence of research conducted for different original purposes by different research communities working without necessarily any direct awareness of how their respective work might eventually connect. The petroleum exploration geologists who originally identified the Chicxulub structure's unusual gravitational and magnetic signature in the late 1970s, working primarily within the practical commercial context of identifying potential petroleum-bearing geological formations, deserve recognition for the careful geophysical survey work that, without their original awareness, had already identified the physical evidence that would eventually prove essential to resolving one of the most significant scientific questions in the entire history of paleontology, illustrating how scientifically valuable discoveries can sometimes emerge from research contexts quite far removed from the eventual scientific significance that eventual discovery comes to hold. The numerous subsequent researchers across multiple countries and multiple scientific disciplines, including geochemists, paleontologists, climate modelers, and planetary scientists, who have contributed to the more than 3 decades of subsequent research refining and extending the basic understanding of the Chicxulub impact established by Hildebrand and his collaborators in the early 1990s, represent a genuinely substantial and genuinely ongoing collaborative scientific effort, one that continues to generate new published research findings on a regular basis as researchers continue to apply new analytical techniques, new fossil discoveries, and new computational modeling capabilities to the continuing scientific project of understanding this catastrophic event with ever-increasing precision and ever-increasing detail. This genuinely collaborative and genuinely international scientific achievement, spanning more than 4 decades and involving researchers across numerous countries and numerous scientific disciplines, illustrates the broader and genuinely important point that major scientific advances of this kind rarely, if ever, represent the achievement of any single individual researcher working in isolation, but rather emerge from the patient, cumulative, and genuinely collaborative efforts of numerous researchers, often working initially without full awareness of how their respective contributions would eventually combine to produce the kind of comprehensive and well-supported scientific understanding that now characterizes contemporary knowledge of the Chicxulub impact and its catastrophic global consequences. The specific question of how confident contemporary scientists actually are regarding the various claims discussed throughout this documentary, ranging from the well-established basic fact of the Chicxulub impact's occurrence to the considerably more uncertain and more actively debated questions regarding pre-impact dinosaur ecology and the precise relationship between the impact and concurrent Deccan Traps volcanism, deserves some explicit and careful consideration as a way of accurately representing the genuine state of contemporary scientific understanding. The basic fact that a major asteroid impact occurred at Chicxulub approximately 66 million years ago, precisely coinciding with the KPG extinction boundary documented in the global fossil record, represents one of the most thoroughly confirmed and most scientifically well-established conclusions in the entire field of paleontology and geology, supported by multiple independent and mutually corroborating lines of evidence, including the iridium geochemical anomaly, the physical crater structure itself, shocked quartz and other characteristic impact mineralogy, precise and consistent radiometric dating across multiple independent sample sets, and the broader global pattern of extinction and survival documented in the fossil record that is consistent with the kind of catastrophic environmental disruption that an impact of this scale and character would be expected to produce. The more specific question of precisely how the impact's various physical effects, including seismic activity, tsunamis, global wildfires, and the longer-term atmospheric and climatic disruption produced by injected dust and sulfate aerosols, combine to produce the specific pattern of mass extinction documented in the fossil record, involves somewhat greater remaining scientific uncertainty, even as the broad outline of this causal mechanism enjoys very substantial scientific support, with ongoing research continuing to refine the specific relative contribution and specific timing of these various contributing physical and ecological processes. The considerably more specific and more actively debated questions regarding pre-impact dinosaur ecological trends, the precise relationship between the Chicxulub impact and concurrent Deccan Traps volcanism, and the precise minute-by-minute reconstruction of events at exceptionally preserved sites including Tanis, represent areas of genuinely ongoing scientific research and legitimate scholarly debate, where contemporary scientific confidence remains considerably more provisional and where reasonable researchers, examining the same underlying evidence, continue to reach somewhat different conclusions regarding the most scientifically appropriate interpretation of the available data. This careful distinction between different levels of scientific confidence across different specific claims discussed throughout this documentary reflects a genuinely important principle in scientific communication more broadly: the recognition that scientific understanding of any sufficiently complex historical or natural phenomenon typically involves a considerable range of confidence levels across different specific component questions, even when, as in the case of the basic Chicxulub impact hypothesis itself, the overall broad scientific picture has achieved a very high and very well-justified degree of confident scientific consensus. The central image that emerges from this full scientific reconstruction of the Chicxulub impact and its catastrophic consequences is one of an almost unimaginably brief moment of cosmic violence, occurring within a span of mere seconds, producing consequences that reshaped the entire trajectory of life on Earth for tens of millions of years following the event. The asteroid that struck the Yucatán Peninsula 66 million years ago gave no warning of its approach to any of the creatures whose world it was about to so catastrophically disrupt, arriving from the depths of space along a trajectory that had been set in motion by gravitational dynamics operating across the solar system for periods of time vastly exceeding the entire span of dinosaur evolutionary history that its arrival was about to so abruptly terminate. The specific contingency of this moment, an object of this particular size following this particular orbital trajectory, happening to intersect with Earth's own orbital position at this particular moment in the planet's 4.5 billion year history, illustrates with particular clarity the genuinely contingent and genuinely unpredictable nature of even the most consequential events in the deep history of life on Earth. The specific scientific journey that allowed researchers to reconstruct this ancient catastrophe, beginning with an unusual geochemical anomaly identified in a thin layer of Italian clay, proceeding through a decade of often contentious scientific debate, and culminating in the identification of the actual physical crater itself, buried beneath the limestone of the Yucatán Peninsula and the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, represents one of the more genuinely remarkable achievements of late 20th and early 21st century Earth science, demonstrating the capacity of careful, evidence-based scientific investigation to reconstruct, with remarkable precision and remarkable confidence, events from periods of Earth's history so distant that they predate not merely human civilization but the entire evolutionary lineage of primates from which human beings would eventually emerge. The specific evolutionary consequences of this catastrophic event, clearing ecological space that mammals would, over the following tens of millions of years, gradually come to occupy and diversify within, established one of the essential preconditions for the eventual emergence of the evolutionary lineage that would, after an enormously long and enormously contingent subsequent evolutionary journey, eventually produce the human species, a species that has, in the relatively brief span of its own existence, developed the scientific capacity to look back across 66 million years of deep time and reconstruct, in remarkable physical and temporal detail, the precise catastrophic event that helped clear the evolutionary path toward its own eventual emergence. This combination of cosmic violence, ecological catastrophe, evolutionary contingency, and eventual scientific reconstruction represents one of the more genuinely profound narratives available within the entire scope of contemporary scientific understanding, connecting an asteroid's brief and violent collision with Earth 66 million years ago to the eventual emergence of a species capable of understanding, in remarkable detail, exactly what happened on that catastrophic day and exactly how its consequences continue to shape the world we inhabit today. The specific locations where contemporary visitors can encounter physical evidence connected to the Chicxulub impact and the broader KPG extinction event, while considerably less visually dramatic than many other categories of historical and prehistoric sites, given that the crater itself remains almost entirely buried and invisible at the Earth's surface, nonetheless offer meaningful opportunities for direct engagement with this scientific story. The Yucatán Peninsula itself, despite the crater's complete burial beneath subsequent limestone deposits, contains the cenotes, natural sinkholes formed in the limestone bedrock that are particularly common and particularly well developed along the specific circular pattern corresponding to the buried crater's rim, a geological pattern that some researchers have connected to the crater's underlying structure influencing subsequent groundwater flow and limestone dissolution patterns in this specific region, offering visitors to this popular Mexican tourist region an indirect but genuine physical connection to the ancient impact structure lying invisibly beneath their feet. Museums around the world, including numerous major natural history museums with significant dinosaur fossil collections, increasingly incorporate detailed exhibits addressing the KPG extinction event and the Chicxulub impact specifically, often displaying actual boundary clay samples containing the characteristic iridium enrichment and shocked quartz evidence that originally allowed researchers to identify and confirm the impact hypothesis, providing visitors with direct physical access to the same category of geological evidence that proved so scientifically decisive in resolving this major paleontological question. The Hell Creek Formation and other major KPG boundary fossil sites across North America, while primarily significant as ongoing active research sites for professional paleontologists rather than as general public tourist destinations, have in some cases developed visitor programs and nearby museum facilities that allow interested members of the public some opportunity to engage with the specific geological and paleontological evidence documenting the final pre-extinction dinosaur ecosystems, and the immediate post-extinction recovery period that this documentary has discussed. This combination of physical sites, museum collections, and ongoing active research locations, while perhaps less immediately visually dramatic than crater rims or excavated ancient cities, nonetheless provides genuinely meaningful opportunities for direct physical and educational engagement with one of the most scientifically significant and most thoroughly documented catastrophic events in the entire deep history of life on Earth, connecting interested visitors to the careful, evidence-based, scientific detective work that this documentary has traced across more than 4 decades of dedicated research. The ongoing scientific research connected to the Chicxulub impact and the broader KPG extinction event continues to develop along multiple active research directions, as researchers across numerous scientific disciplines continue to apply new techniques and new evidence to refine understanding of this catastrophic event and its consequences. Continued analysis of rock core samples from the Chicxulub crater itself, including samples obtained through a major scientific drilling expedition conducted in 2016 that recovered rock cores from within the crater's peak ring structure, continues to provide researchers with detailed physical evidence regarding the specific geological processes involved in crater formation and regarding the specific timeline of biological recovery within the crater environment itself following the initial catastrophic impact, research that has revealed, among other findings, evidence for surprisingly rapid microbial and eventually more complex biological recolonization of the crater environment within a geologically brief period following the initial catastrophic impact. Ongoing paleontological fieldwork at the Tanis site and at other exceptionally preserved KPG boundary locations continues to generate new fossil discoveries and new scientific publications addressing the precise immediate aftermath of the impact event, even as some of the more specific and more dramatic claims associated with sites like Tanis continue to undergo careful scientific scrutiny and independent verification through the normal processes of scientific peer review and replication that any significant scientific claim must undergo before achieving broad scientific acceptance. Continued refinement of climate and atmospheric modeling, incorporating updated physical data regarding the specific composition and quantity of material the Chicxulub impact would have injected into the atmosphere, continues to refine scientific understanding of the precise severity and precise duration of the resulting impact winter and associated photosynthesis collapse. Work that connects directly to ongoing efforts to model other potential future catastrophic scenarios, including both future asteroid impacts and potential nuclear winter scenarios that share underlying atmospheric and climatic mechanisms with the ancient Chicxulub event. This continuing, genuinely active, and genuinely multidisciplinary scientific research program, more than 4 decades after the Alvarez team's initial 1980 publication first proposed the impact hypothesis, illustrates how a major scientific question, even one addressing events from 66 million years in the deep past, can continue to generate productive and increasingly detailed scientific investigation across multiple subsequent scientific generations, as each advance in available technique, available evidence, or available computational modeling capability opens new avenues for refining and deepening contemporary understanding of exactly what happened on that catastrophic day and exactly how its consequences continue to be felt, in ways both direct and indirect, across the entire subsequent history of life on Earth. Tonight, deep beneath the limestone bedrock of the Yucatán Peninsula and the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, the Chicxulub crater remains exactly where it has remained for 66 million years, an enormous and entirely invisible scar marking the precise location where an asteroid's catastrophic collision with Earth fundamentally altered the trajectory of life on this planet. The non-avian dinosaurs that dominated terrestrial ecosystems for more than 150 million years before that catastrophic day are gone. Their fossilized remains scattered across geological formations on every continent, preserving evidence of a diversity and an ecological dominance that the fossil record documents in considerable and often genuinely remarkable detail, even as the specific creatures themselves, with the singular exception of their bird descendants, vanished entirely from the Earth within what was, by the standards of deep geological time, an almost instantaneous catastrophic event. What remains, 66 million years later, is a scientific story whose careful reconstruction across more than 4 decades of dedicated research represents one of the more genuinely remarkable achievements of modern Earth science. An unusual layer of iridium-enriched clay, first identified in Italian rock formations, that led researchers toward an enormous buried crater that had, unknown to anyone involved, already been discovered by petroleum geologists working for entirely unrelated commercial purposes. A precise radiometric dating that connects this buried crater to the exact geological moment of the most significant mass extinction event in the past 66 million years. Fossil sites preserving evidence from literally the same catastrophic day, including fish whose gills still contain the tiny glass spherules that rained down from the sky in the hours following the impact. The mammals that survived this catastrophe, small and ecologically modest creatures that had existed in the shadow of dinosaur dominance for the entirety of the preceding 100 million years, found themselves, in the aftermath of this global catastrophe, occupying a transformed world filled with ecological opportunities that the elimination of dinosaurs had suddenly and dramatically opened. Over the following tens of millions of years, through an evolutionary process involving enormous contingency and enormous complexity, this surviving mammalian lineage would eventually produce the primates, and eventually, after an additional sequence of evolutionary developments spanning millions of further years, the human species itself, a species that has, in the relatively brief span of its own existence, developed the remarkable scientific capacity to look back across this vast expanse of deep time and reconstruct, in genuinely astonishing detail, the precise catastrophic chain of events that helped clear an evolutionary path toward its own eventual emergence. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.